security, our prosperity, and our values. And the stakes could hardly be higher. The world today is more dangerous than it's been for decades. War rages in Ukraine and the Middle East. Conflict, climate change, and hunger has displaced more than 100 million people globally. And new technologies like AI create both new opportunities and significant new risks. That's why the UK has made a hard and fast pledge to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. We're taking unprecedented action to stop the boats and reduce migration. And I'm pleased that the G7 has today committed to closer coordination on AI safety, following the UK's lead at Bletchley Park. Because the problems we face are global in nature, so we need global solutions. And that's what I've been arguing for at this G7 summit. First, on migration. Illegal migration is now a global emergency. More people are moving across borders than at any time in our history. We cannot stand by and watch this human tragedy unfold. The G7 has focused on dealing with the root causes of migration, including a new package of UK development assistance for Africa and Italy's new Apulia Food Systems initiative to tackle food insecurity. We're also doing more to combat the people traffickers, because we all agree that it's for sovereign nations to control their borders and not criminal gangs. And the G7 has today launched a new coalition to counter people smuggling. And I'm particularly pleased that the G7 has also agreed to work together to make sure the governance of migration is increasingly effective and sustainable. The second area of G7 action is on China. China's assertiveness has only intensified since our last summit in Hiroshima. Their actions threaten to undermine the free and open Indo-Pacific. They've conducted cyber targeting of democratically elected British MPs. And China is increasingly working together with other authoritarian states like Iran, North Korea, and Russia. Around 80% of Russia's battlefield components come from Chinese companies. And that's why the UK has issued sanctions against Chinese entities interfering with our democracy. It's why we've protected our technologies and supply chains through the National Security Investment Act. And it's why we'll always act in concert with allies to deter China's most aggressive actions and protect our economic security. But we need to keep the pressure on. The UK and others have already sanctioned Chinese entities for facilitating Russia's defence industry. The G7 has now agreed with that principle. So the message is clear. If you prop up Russia's war economy, prolonging this illegal war, you will pay a price. And that leads to my third point, the G7's complete and total unity with Ukraine. Ukraine's security is our security. We are in this for the long term. Putin will not outlast us. The UK has committed £3 billion of military aid every year to the end of the decade. We're dialing up the economic pressure on Russia with 50 new sanctions this week alone. And we've just announced over £240 million for reconstruction. But as I've long argued, Russia itself must pay for the destruction it has caused. And now, Russia will pay. Because at this summit, the G7 has reached a historic breakthrough. After months of intensive discussions, we've agreed a new loan for Ukraine worth $50 billion. And it will be repaid, not by our taxpayers, but by the extraordinary revenues that come from frozen Russian assets in Europe and around the world. This is just, and it is right. But true justice will only come when Russia leaves Ukraine. Tomorrow I will be travelling to the Ukraine Peace Summit in Switzerland. Our goal is peace. But let us not confuse peace with surrender. Putin's Russia is the aggressor. They brought war to a peaceful continent, wreaked death and devastation on the people of Ukraine, caused famine and hardship around the world. So peace must be based on international law and the UN Charter, and it must be on Ukraine's terms. That is what justice looks like. That is what we must work towards. That is how we secure a future for Ukraine that is peaceful, democratic, and free. And we, the G7, will stand united with Ukraine until that day comes. Thank you. We'll just turn to some questions from the media. If we start with the I.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Hugo Jai from the I. You've talked about the need to defend Ukraine. You met Volodymyr Zelensky here. Were you able to reassure him that the UK will continue to support Ukraine no matter the result of the general election? And more broadly, what steps is the G7 taking to ensure that Western support for Ukraine remains solid despite scepticism from certain figures, the likes of Donald Trump, Marine Le Pen, who may come to power in the near future?
Well, I can only assure President Zelensky about what I would do if I was Prime Minister, but I am able to give him that reassurance that our support for Ukraine will continue not just today, but for as long as it takes. But I can make that commitment to him because I've made the decision to increase defence spending. So under a Conservative government, defence spending will continue to rise to 2.5% of GDP, and that's why I can say to Vladimir, we will be here with you, providing the same level of support for as long as it takes. Because I recognise the world we're living in is more dangerous and challenging than it has been at any point in our past, and that requires us to spend more, to invest more in our security, and ultimately Ukraine are fighting for all our freedom. Russia is a threat to our values, to the sovereignty of European nations. It won't stop if it's successful in Ukraine, and that's why it's the right thing to do to support Ukraine. That's why it's the right thing to do to invest more in our defence. I can make that commitment to him, but that's because I've got a clear plan to increase defence spending. Keir Starmer and the Labour Party are not going to match that pledge. Defence spending will not rise under a future Labour government. They've been very clear about that. So how he is going to keep the UK safe and people safe and protect us from the threats around the world and deter Russia is a question for him. Because also the point I'd make is by putting a firm commitment on it and a timeline, it sends a very strong signal of deterrence to our adversaries that we're not going away, that they can't outlast us. Because we have a long-term commitment to increase defence spending, that makes a difference when it comes to deterrence, and it also gives us the moral authority to lead in Europe and across NATO, to ask other allies to invest more. That's what we did 10 years ago in 2014 when the 2% pledge was put in place. We were one of a handful of countries that met it then. That number has increased over time. And again, there's a NATO summit.
That's Rishi Sunak speaking at the G7 summit in Puglia in Italy. He said illegal migration is a global emergency. The G7 is focused on the root causes. On China, he said, if you prop up Russia's economy, you'll pay a heavy price. And he said that a huge Ukraine loan is a historic breakthrough.